Good morning. That's the title of my talk, and as you see, I have quite a number of colleagues who are sharing this. Blame it all on them. I would also, I have more colleagues, and some of them will also follow in this session, speaking about the relationship between urbanization and urbanization and forest, especially in Amazonia, and especially two colleagues, Eduardo Brundizio and Robin Sears, who I'm sure are going to speak about this in a much more coherent way than I will. I need to confess that working in cities is actually quite a new thing for me, and it's just this sort of shameless behavior of coming here and getting you to tell me, what's going on. To present it at a conference is probably not quite the right thing. But the reason I, at least, have started working also in cities is because essentially I'm following those folks that I've been studying for the last 30-some years who have always lived in the countryside. I'm not sure whether, I guess most of you are probably aware that the UN at least tells us that 2008 is a very important year. It's the year that 50% of the human race is living in cities. Perhaps today that one person left the Chinese countryside and moved to the city. And so now we are largely an urban species. So we're following people there, and obviously people have, there've always been, and it's always been known that there are relationships between cities and forests, and cities and rural areas. But what I would like to do is to try to draw some really quite direct linkages by actually tracing issues of migration and so forth. And as soon as I figure this out, I'm going to. And for those of you who may still think of the Amazonian landscape, after all, this is the largest forest on Earth in Amazonia, may think of an Amazonian landscape as a landscape of a sort of big green tree-filled thing. This also is an Amazonian landscape. That's actually the city of Belém, which in the last 2 years or so became not the largest city in Amazonia, but was actually surpassed by Manaus as the largest city in Amazonia. It's a city of more than 2 million people at this point, and there are quite a number of rather large cities these days in Amazonia. And urbanization has now reached in the Brazilian Amazon, and what is defined as the legal Amazon in Brazil. Urbanization has reached about 70%. And in some parts of Amazonia, for instance, in the state of Amapa, the northernmost state in Brazil, and the state where we actually, with a large group of people, conduct some of our research on relationships between rural resource use and urbanization, the ratio, the percentage of urbanized population is actually over 90%. So to try to understand the social life of forests in Amazonia without thinking of the social life of cities is essentially meaningless. We need to look at cities, and we need to know what's going on in cities in order to have even an inkling of what's going on in rural areas, including forest areas. I specifically want to look at this point. We've explored a few other, a number of ways in which cities and rural areas are related, and a number of ways in which migration into cities has an impact on forests in Amazonia. But today specifically, I would like to look at issues of, for instance, of employment, of what do those migrants actually do? What does it mean that people are leaving rural areas and migrating to cities? And I'd like to suggest to you that it's actually extremely complex, and therefore to understand the impact of that migration into cities is very difficult, and at least leads me to question a lot of the models that we know have worked in explaining the relationship between rural to urban migration and forests in other parts of the world, especially in Europe or in the northeast of the United States or in Puerto Rico or a number of other places where these issues have been discussed at length. So I'm sort of trying to take a little attempt to talk about forest transition in a not too coherent way, mind you, but looking at the issue of migration and the issue of rural-urban migration in the discussion of forest transition tends to be very important. An important trajectory that leads to a forest transition is that presumably higher paying jobs become available in cities. Rural populations therefore leave, go to the cities. The cost of labor in rural areas rises. People therefore take their land, much of their land, out of agriculture, put it into some kind of forest or just let it reforest, and agriculture then just becomes concentrated in a few highly productive zones. And this seems to explain a lot of what's happened in sort of classically in forest transitions in more developed, in the developed world. But what I would like to suggest is, at least when we look at these floodplain regions of Amazonia, and that is admittedly not all of Amazonia. Actually, what I've always looked at, both in the rural and in the urbans, in my urban work, is to look at the floodplains of Amazonia, which are only constitute about 2 to 3% of the entire territory. But of course, 2 to 3% of Amazonia is some enormous hunk of land, bigger than all your Belgiums and all that sort of thing. And it's also historically and socially an extremely important area, has always been an area of heavy settlement and all. What it isn't, however, it's not the frontier areas that we tend to hear about in Amazonia, the big areas of deforestation, the areas of these sort of instant cities with no hinterlands and so forth. This is the area of the older cities. This is the area of long-term settlement. These are the areas where the great majority of people, probably are of the group that's known in Brazil as caboclos. They tend to be rural, often indigenous, but not officially indigenous people. And in Peru, they're known as ribereños, also people who have lived there for a long time, and they're partly Amazonians, partly Europeans, these mixed mestizo or whatever cultures. And what I'd like to suggest that even though, if we look at the numbers, if we look at what's happening with people, where the census says people are and what they're doing, and if we look at some of the official data for what's happening with forest cover, it looks like we've got forest transition in lots of places, or not lots, in several places in the floodplain. But if we actually look at land use, if we actually look at migration, if we actually look at employment patterns, this doesn't seem to fit these models at all. And therefore, I don't have a definitive answer to all this, but at least I can say, I think this is really complex. And perhaps the idea that we actually have turned that around in that curve and are now seeing forests increase, and that's going to continue, is at best questionable. So there are 2 research sites, and I must say that I'm showing a lot of sites that actually are going to be discussed by the other folks here who are talking about urban areas, and my apologies, I'm using some of their images, but I got to go first, so you get to see it first on my presentation. So there are 2 sites, and they're sort of at the opposite ends of Amazonia. One is in the estuary, and does this has a thing as well? Or no?
Pointer, the red dot.
The red thing, okay. So in the estuary, this is all in the floodplain, right? Here's the city of Belém that I showed. And I'm going to be talking about this area right here called Massagão, right outside the capital of Amapa, which is the city of Macapá. And later I'm going to talk about the upper Amazon, actually along the Ucayali River in the Peruvian Amazon, around the city of Pucallpa. Okay, so the people who are migrating, the urban destinations that I'm going to talk about are mostly Macapá here, and they're coming from Massagão going to Macapá. And in Pucallpa, they're coming from all around these areas and going into the city of Pucallpa. Okay, and again, these are ribereños in Peru, caboclos in Brazil, people who are rural producers, forest managers, agriculturists, and so forth. Very wonderful, very complex types of agriculture, forest management, agroforestry, have always done many, many, many different things. And now they're doing still other things. This shows, and this is from Eduardo Brondizio, these are official data showing changes in forest cover by municipality in the estuary of the Amazon in Brazil. And these are all of the municipalities, and the one I'm talking about is Massagao right here. And what it shows, all of these bars that go above the line, is positive, it's increase in forest cover. This is between 2000 and 2004. And as you can see, virtually all of the municipalities of this area actually have increasing forest cover. And Massagao has sort of significant. These are not huge increases. These are, large municipalities, many of them. And so as far as territory, they're not huge, but they seem very significant. I mean, the story we hear from Amazonia is always a story of deforestation. And here we actually have increasing forest cover, and this is in Massagao, okay? And that was some absolutely marvelous image that I can't even remember what was there, but in any case. And so we see forest cover increasing. And then if we look at where people are, and this is from census material, I'll get the hang of this sometime. You can see that the urban population of, these are two municipalities, Macapá and Massagao. The urban populations are increasing, and the reason Macapá increases much more than Massagao, because people go from Massagao, it's got a little bit of an urban area, but they basically go into Macapá and Santana, and the rural populations have decreased. And this looks like sort of classic, I think, is what classic forest transition stuff would look like. You get people leaving rural areas, and you get forest cover is increasing. Admittedly, a short time period for this forest cover increasing, and these aren't national populations or whatever, but still, it sort of looks good that way. But first of all, we need to know, and this is the story that we've all talked about, what is a forest? What is this forest cover that we're talking about? And this is not a very good way of representing it, but just if you can follow me, the only thing here that's sort of not forest cover is the red stuff, oh God, I'm sorry. These are agricultural fields. These are sort of annual crops and the sort of semi-annuals that you tend to find in Amazonia. So here in 1994, in our study sites in Massagao, taking what is a land holding, a typical land holding, and we had I can't remember exactly the sample, but when we took these land holdings that tend to be about 25 hectares, and we looked at how they were divided, in 1994 you can see that there was sort of a significant amount of land in field crops, and in 2005 you see that reduced tremendously. What you also see, there's something here called forest, which is reasonably mature forest. We don't even talk about primary or anything. All of this is heavily managed for extremely long periods of time. But we see actually a reduction of what might be called mature forest being replaced largely by lots of fallow, and this, which is really what Eduardo Brondizio is absolutely the world's expert on it, is the management of acai palms. Those of you who are looking good and go to the gym often know about acai. It's that great drink that's supposed to keep us healthy forever. It's this astounding thing that all of a sudden this Amazonian product, which always characterized just completely rural consumption. It was the mark of being a caboclo, the mark of being a sort of country bumpkin. To eat acai now has become the chicest thing in New York and in Sao Paulo and all that. And so you get this great increase in forest cover. These are trees, these are palms. But exactly what we're talking about forest transitions is more complex. I mean, far be it from me to say that I don't think that this is some kind of tree cover, and much of it actually does look like forest. A lot of it is very diverse, but it's complex. It's difficult to just see, you know, forests increasing and people decreasing. And then when we look at these people and look at what this migration means, again, we have tremendous complexity. First of all, there's an awful lot of circular migration. People are going into cities, people are going out of cities very, very often. We've collected astounding histories of people moving around. Secondly, and I think Eduardo may probably talk about this a bit more, is most households are multi-sited. I mean, most of them have houses, really, and it really is most of them, have houses in both the city and in the rural area. And where they get counted by that census or how they want to represent themselves, or we're now urban, is a real question. You know, what does that curve going down really mean in some of these instances? And the other thing, and this is what I really wanted to talk about more, is that many of those urban residents actually work in the countryside. They depend on rural employment, not just on processing timber or something, but they actually go out and they cut timber. You know, there's exactly what it means to be urban at this point is also very complex. So let me just go very quickly through some of the, again, 93% have a sort of second home in the city, or sometimes they have a first home in the city. And very often that migration takes place because of education needs. People go to cities because of the services they provide, as far as we can tell. I mean, there are mixed reasons why people go to cities, but employment tends not to be the most important reason. They go to cities because they've got, they want to put their kids into secondary school. They go to cities because they're sick. They're chronically sick. They want to be close to medical facilities and so forth. They also go back and forth. We're doing a lot of stuff on people traveling back and forth, and people make tremendous numbers of trips to cities. And some of it is because, at least in Brazil, there are a lot of new government sort of welfare policies. There are pensions for farmers. There are other kinds of payments. And even though many of these are phrased in terms of keeping people in the countryside because they're pensions for farmers, you have to prove that you worked your life as a farmer, you have to collect it in a city. And it actually draws people into cities. And that constant movement really makes a difference. So we have people making, you know, weekly trips. Now, I'm not showing you exactly where these people are, and they're not very far from the city, but still, they are rural folks. And then when well, looking at the rural residents, this is just a graph showing where people now get most of their income in our study sites. And you can see this is acai. This is from selling acai. And some of it is from selling manioc. And some of it may be from logging. But if you look and you know, there's a very large percentage has nothing to do with working in rural areas, except for the fact that you had to at some time prove that you were a farmer so you could collect retirement benefits. But a very large amount of people's income now of the rural folks, doesn't come from rural natural resource sources. Oh, Lordy, I haven't even gotten to it. In any case, just as a very, very interesting issue, when we actually found in the sample 16% of the people had no non-rural income, right? So they were only dependent on rural incomes. We found those people, the majority of them had very recently moved from the city to the rural area. I won't explain it now, but just think about that. That's interesting. Let me just very quickly go to the Peruvian example. And again, as I said, this is around this very unlovely city of Pucallpa, which has exploded also in growth. It's grown something like six-fold over the last 20 years or so. It's where the road that goes over the Andes, it's where it hits the Amazon and stops, you know. So it's a real gateway into Amazonia. It's also an area of tremendous amount of logging, a lot of it illegal. Actually, the idea of what's illegal doesn't even make sense to talk about there. It's an area of a lot of coca production as well. So we're talking. The city of Pucallpa itself has 579 named shantytowns, which all resulted from the, quote, invasion of land either owned by the state or by private folks. And everyone says it's chaotic, but actually it's not chaotic. It's extremely well organized. In order to, you have to organize yourself to take over land, and so they're all very organized, but there's a tremendous number of them, and they're not, as far as infrastructure and all, they're not very organized. And quite frankly, to me at least, they look rather rural. You know, the materials they use and all to build houses and all look quite rural. And as I said, people initially moved to these areas to look for services, I think much more than employment. Here's another missing image, and I can't go over that, but I'd like to tell you that's very much like what I showed about Amapa, that people, basically what you see is far less in annual crops, somewhat less in forest, and a lot more in forest cover of various kinds. Pastures are reduced, annual crops are reduced, fallows, managed forests, and so forth tend to increase. That's also the situation there. And here, where we just recently did a survey of 101 families living in 10 different shanty towns in Pucallpa, we actually found that only 11% of the 101 families didn't actually have rural-based incomes. That 89% at least had one active economic sort of person in that employed person in the family that was working in an essentially rural occupation. And the most common one was logging. Secondly, it was farming, and that either meant that you traveled sort of an hour and a half by canoe and actually had a farm out there in some peri-urban zone, or you left for 3 weeks at a time and farmed somewhere pretty far out. Another thing, fishing was very, very common. Coca, I was floored, because this isn't, well, a lot of it is people going out to collect coca, being paid to do that. At times, about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, they would say that you couldn't find a young man anywhere in Pucallpa because everybody was out harvesting coca, because you could make a good living that way. But what I was surprised, a lot of these people actually have coca plots, and they leave every 3 months. Coca grows like a weed. They leave every 3 months, they harvest their coca field, and they come back to the city, and they are urban residents, but they're living off completely rural incomes. And logging, it's really logging crews are recruited in the city, the equipment comes from the city, everybody gets paid in the city. So the few people who go out on logging crews who may actually live in rural areas, then they have to go to the city to get paid, or they won't get paid. So it essentially is sort of an urban organized occupation as well. So what does it mean that people have left rural areas and gone into urban areas in Amazonia? At best, it's very complex. The distinctions between urban and rural are increasingly blurred. Everybody said that a lot. And here, I think they're blurred in ways that at least I found somewhat unexpected. There's the famous thing Berta Becker, a Brazilian geographer, had called Amazonia an urbanized forest. But we also see sort of ruralized cities. The shanty towns sort of look quite rural. As Eduardo Brundisi has written, their consumption patterns are largely rural, and their occupations are largely rural. There's a huge pool of cheap labor that tends to be unemployed most of the time. And that labor is recruited for logging, it's recruited for agricultural work, it's recruited for coca production all the time. So I think at best we can say that the impact on forests of this urbanization is very difficult to predict. And actually, as far as logging, these people who at this point are not occupied with other agricultural work may actually have a greater impact as far as logging on the Amazonian forest than they did when they were officially rural. Thanks very much.
We have time for a couple of quick questions. Just Bella, please.
One of the things that I was thinking about was actually the work of Tom Rudell and state transfers and forest recovery in Puerto Rico. And in your previous thing, it looked like you put together, what did you say, 85% of the population got state transfers in one way or another. So do you want to sort of comment on that? Because we have all of these other forms of income and so on. And of course,
Yeah.
globalized acai thing, but the role of these transfers seems to be at least as important as almost anything else.
Yes, well, I think it's the remittances that you've talked about and many other anything. I think it's absolutely. You know, it's a little more. It seems a little more direct. But I think this is very important. You know, and I hesitate to call it all urban income, but it's certainly not rural resource use income anymore, and it has many parallels to this, except that, well, yeah, it does, right? It actually brings people into the city in order to collect, which I suppose a lot of the other transfers must too. You got to go to your Western Union office or something in order to collect it. Or there's an ATM, I guess, yeah, right.
I hope you're past the Foucault syndrome now. The caffeine is sinking in, I hope. So I want to raise two issues. They're not only referring to your paper, they're more general. But maybe it's time to raise them more explicitly. And one is a methodological issue, and that is using two measuring points that are quite close in time, I can't remember, 1994, 2004, and then use that to suggest a trend. With other words, structural forest cover change is methodologically a bit tricky, of course, especially since...
Tricky is the polite word, I assume. Right?
No, but you know, I've done it myself. Others have done it. I mean, but for us, it's critical because we're talking about forest, reforestation, deforestation. So that's one thing I wanted to raise. It's not just your paper. I would like your reaction to that too. And the second is related to it, and it's the big ghost, of course, hovering behind us, and it has been raised in different contexts before. I'm wondering, okay, the conference is a social life of forest, so it's maybe not so polite, but how useful is really, I mean, to what extent is using forest, because we all do it, of course, right, in our papers, is that a restraining factor? Does it limit our analysis and our descriptions? Because forest, of course, forest is nature. And it's a term that is born, that is forged within the nature-culture dichotomy, which I think if we would, you know, nobody of us would accept that. But so by still using, we all problematizing, you know, in our papers, but by still using it, it's a sort of like the resistance paradigm. We're resisting against, you know, colonialism, imperialism, but we're turning it on its head, but we're still working and analyzing and describing within that framework, so we're still restrained, and I feel that most of us are beyond that, but by highlighting forest, and we're also always talking about deforestation, forest resurgence, reforestation, we are still within this nature culture paradigm, and how do we, what is a way to getting beyond that? Thank you. I'm not expecting you to answer this all. Maybe you do,
but I will. No, first of all, that 4-year business is it's obviously true. Eduardo, who actually knows how to do this kind of stuff, I think has far better data, and you'll probably find out about it, right? Somehow in the Amazonian context, I feel more comfortable doing this only because we are so much sort of arguing against that constant insistence only on deforestation, so that we even have a sort of a 4-year period there, and we actually see that over quite a broad area there is more forest cover. You notice I keep using the word forest cover rather, or, you know, it's what we're talking about is tree cover. it seems like an incredible thing that should be reported. On the other hand, to some extent, I also want to make the point, and I hope I've made it, that all ideas of sort of forest transition in this area, I mean, we need to talk about how long any forest transition that we're thinking about actually would remain, you know? I mean, are these guys just going to go back? I mean, the idea is that somehow this has happened and now for the end of time we have more forest, but I think it's often very temporary. The other thing I'd like to say is that people have looked at these sort of ideas of forest transition in Amazonia and have disaggregated Amazonia into various zones, and this is like Purse and Skull and all this. And Tom Rudell, who was standing right there. And I'm talking about a very, very specific, I'm talking about the floodplain. And the data I presented was only from two places. But I actually think that these are sort of trends. And it also has to do with agriculture and stuff. You know, I think that the data are for 4 years, but the data are, that I feel more comfortable than I might. And with the what is a forest and why are we still talking about forests, I think that maybe I won't go into that right now, but maybe
okay.
in like whenever when we talk to people more informally, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Great. Okay. Very quickly, please.
Great presentation. What is it really seems like you're talking about circulation. In various forms as a sort of new way that people are interacting with their farmsteads. So I guess the question would be, what sets of agricultural activities are really consistent with circulation? For instance, one would think that the keeping of livestock probably is not, whereas various kinds of agroforestry might be. So one way to sort of maybe specify some of the landscape changes, sort of that last question about impact of forest, would be to think in terms of, okay, what kinds of agricultural activities are consistent with circulation? What's the thought?
Actually, it's not quite circulation. This is really interesting because we always thought, you know, that we talk about circular migration. People go into cities, people come out. In Amazonia, especially in Pucallpa, they don't go home necessarily. You know, they don't go back to their rural areas. They go to other rural areas. I mean, a lot of it is also there's fishing and all. The logging, then some people are going back and logging their own areas, but a lot of people are just going out and logging. Somebody's told them about trees someplace, they go there. But even the agriculture, they just go and farm someplace else. You know, and at least in the uplands outside the floodplain in Amazonia, there's quite a lot of land, so people just go off. But the other, it is interesting, thank you for that. You know, we can talk about what kinds of production are especially possible, and coca appears to be one of them. I mean, among other things, presumably when they go out and try to catch you, if you're a coca producer, you're not there anyway, you know. So, but the coca is just growing, and you know, agroforestry things may well be one of those particularly good types of production. Sorry.
We'll have to continue it informally, lest we eat lunch at 3 o'clock.